A temporary ceasefire has been declared in Russia's war on Ukraine. The day before, a local ceasefire was established near the temporarily occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to carry out repairs on a backup 330 kV power transmission line. This was announced by the International Atomic Energy Agency in October. Let me remind you, when Trump met with Zelensky, the Russians were already using the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant ceasefire topic for manipulation, claiming that it was Ukraine that supposedly did not want peace. But even now, Russia still relies on manipulation. I'll explain everything in this episode. Let's begin. For example, the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation claimed that the West is supposedly considering sabotage at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant with the meltdown of its nuclear reactor cores. That's exactly when, let me remind you, a ceasefire was declared there. That's what we'll talk about with you in the first part of this episode, and in the second part we'll discuss new details about the disappearance of Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. I'm Alexei Pechi, let's discuss this together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and leave any comment under this episode. Subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechi News using the link in this video's description. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so financially with any donation or a paid sponsorship subscription using the links and details in the description of this video. There you'll find Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, PayPal, bank details, crypto wallets, and YouTube sponsorship. Choose any format that's convenient for you. I would appreciate any support from you. So, the International Atomic Energy Agency statement notes that on the morning of November 7, a local ceasefire came into effect near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. In particular, demining and other preparatory work began near the damaged section of the Ferosplavnaya 1 330 kV power transmission line. It is noted that its connection to the power plant was cut off 6 months ago. It is located on the temporarily occupied side. Repair work on the damaged Ferosplavnaya 1 power line began as early as November 8. This was publicly announced by the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi. He previously said that a ceasefire would allow repair work to begin, aimed at strengthening the plant's connections to external power supply and preventing a nuclear incident. Quote, under the conditions of a local ceasefire established with the mediation of the International Atomic Energy Agency, technical specialists today began repairing the remaining damaged section of the Ferosplavnaya 1 power line near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I would like to note here that connecting this line will allow the refueling power plant to once again have two independent power sources. We're talking about the main 750 kilowatt line as well as the backup 330 kilowatt line. The work will be monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency team, which is permanently stationed at the facility. And now the United Nations organization has reminded that the preliminary restoration of external power supply to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant 2 weeks ago was also made possible thanks to temporary ceasefire agreements coordinated with the involvement of the International Atomic Energy Agency. The initial plan called for the simultaneous restoration of 2 lines at once. However, during the repair of the 750 kV main line, additional damage was found on the backup line closer to the plant, in the area that was not included in the previously agreed ceasefire boundaries. This caused a delay in the work, and now a ceasefire has been declared again in this area. Let me remind you that since September 23, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant has been receiving energy from backup diesel generators. The Russians staged a provocation and shut down the plant. And as you recall, there was news about it. Everyone was very nervous because there was a real risk of an accident. A month later, it was reported that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant's power supply switched to external sources, with diesel generators turned off and on standby. I'll also remind you that the Russian attack on October 30 on Ukrainian energy infrastructure damaged a substation. The staff at the South Ukrainian nuclear power plant and at the Khmelnytskyi nuclear power plant confirmed that each of the plants lost access to one of their external power transmission lines. Also, the International Atomic Energy Agency team at the Rivne nuclear power plant reported that the plant reduced the output of 2 of its 4 units at the request of the grid operator. That is, the Russians are actively targeting Ukraine's nuclear facilities. But now, against this backdrop, the Russians have decided to launch another fake story against Ukraine. The Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation stated that Ukraine is preparing a sabotage at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, where repairs are currently underway. Quote, "The West is considering the option of sabotage at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, with the meltdown of the active zone of its nuclear reactors." Well, there you go. Russian intelligence also noted that allegedly NATO member countries are directly urging Ukraine, saying yes, go ahead already, urging Kyiv to carry out sabotage with casualties among Ukrainians and residents of the European Union. They say, make sure there are Ukrainians and Europeans, but only then carry out the sabotage. So, according to the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, residents of Ukraine and invited citizens of European Union countries near Ukraine's western border will allegedly be in the area of radioactive particle dispersion. Meanwhile, Moscow believes that if sabotage happens, they already know who they'll blame for the accident. On unwashed Russia. But let me remind you that the last time, when they also planned to introduce a ceasefire regime at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the Russians tried to manipulate even this topic. Right during the period when Zelensky was meeting with Trump at the White House in October. The Russians requested a temporary ceasefire to carry out repair work at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. At that time, in such an ultimatum, the head of Rosatom, Alexei Likhachev, stated that there should be a ceasefire on October 17. But the thing is, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant had been without power since September 23, and Ukraine had already proposed that same ceasefire for repairing the power lines. But the Russians, after showing up, continued the shelling, connected generators, and kept on shelling. And so when Zelensky was discussing peace talks to end the war with Trump, the Russians made a public proposal for a local ceasefire. Like, look, they're ready for a truce. On the same day, Putin and Trump spoke on the phone, and the Kremlin also brought up this topic, hinting that Ukraine itself wasn't ready for a truce, even a local one. Look, Zelensky is asking for an end to the war. Let's at least start with that. A few hours later, Lavrov clarified that they weren't against a ceasefire, but wanted a complete end to the war. Well, as I promised, in the second part of the episode, we'll talk about that very Lavrov. Today, American media report that Lavrov has suddenly fallen out of favor with Putin. Cable news network says Lavrov missed the high-level meeting with Putin by mutual agreement. Lavrov was the only permanent member of the Russian Security Council who missed the meeting where the nuclear test was announced. It was also announced that the foreign minister won't lead the Russian delegation at the G20 summit in Johannesburg later this month. On November 4, Putin signed a decree appointing a more junior official, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Presidential Administration Maxim, as the head of the delegation. Everyone is saying that Lavrov messed up in his conversation with Marco Rubio on October 21 when he ruined the meeting between Trump and Putin in Budapest. But here, Cable News Network cites another episode. Lavrov honed a bold, confrontational style of diplomacy that often matched Putin's imperial ambitions. At a recent summit with Trump in Anchorage, Alaska, the Russian foreign minister arrived wearing a sweater with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics logo. But the trolling didn't have the desired effect. On the contrary, it angered the Trump administration. After Trump made it clear that the meeting in Budapest was cancelled, Kirill Dmitriev, the Kremlin's special representative, flew to the United States to try to restore justice. Ultimately, the publication concludes that Lavrov will remain Minister of Foreign Affairs. After all, under Putin, loyalty and continuity are still highly valued. Quote, "It seems that even when the Kremlin dictator faces serious setbacks, his response often comes down to rearranging the chairs." I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye.